As I reach a certain milestone age, I think how profound is the period in Jewish history in which I have spent what I pray will be only the first two-thirds of my life. I was born during the height of European Jewish slaughter, arguably in the very worst moments in our history. My earliest memories include my mother coming home visibly traumatized from greeting Holocaust survivors at the New Orleans docks. A tiny, precarious Jewish state, utterly unaccepted by any of its neighbors, was born as I started kindergarten. I spent my first year in Israel well before the Six-Day War, living in a Jerusalem small enough to tour entirely on foot in a couple of hours. At this time, a wealthy person was defined as someone who did not have to turn on a switch 2 hours before she wanted hot water. Although Israel fought its own wars, there was a clear sense of dependence for survival on American government support, and Israelis needed financial help from diaspora Jewry to an extent that would be impossible for a young Zionist to understand today. Somehow, within a few decades, Israel became a powerhouse among nations, with a population that includes half of world Jewry and is growing. Israel is the center, clearly, of the Jewish world and the future of the Jewish people. Consider the staggering talent of leadership that brought the State of Israel to be such a profound fact in Jewish history. My privilege tonight is to introduce and welcome to the Conference of Presidents one of the indisputable heroes of the miracle of the State of Israel, Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu. I will try to speak to facts and avoid politics. Some of you won't think I succeeded. 40 years ago, Bibi was a young Israeli diplomat in the United States who captured all of us with his uniquely articulate English and his riveting, persuasive speeches. Later, as leader of the Likud party, he held several cabinet positions and 25 years ago began his first term as prime minister. During two separate terms totaling nearly 15 years, Bibi became the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. During the decades in which Bibi was the clearly dominant figure in Israeli leadership, Israel grew and underwent changes that only a prophet could have anticipated. A national magazine identified Israel, correctly or not, as the eighth most powerful nation in the world. The old and well-known cliche that the way to leave Israel with a small fortune is to arrive with a large fortune has not only become wrong, but is now patently ridiculous. Israeli business opportunity is amazing, and Israeli technology creates a better world to an extent that is insanely disproportionate to Israel's size. An increasing group of Israel's formerly hostile neighbors have moved toward alliance with Israel in a serious way, and there's much more to say. There's no doubt in my mind that the period of the Israeli miracle that has brought us to a new level of strength, power, and influence in the world, though many factors and many people have contributed to it, will forever be identified with Bibi Netanyahu, just as the foundation of the state, with all the other people involved, will forever be identified with the likes of David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. And I say this with full knowledge that historic figures with the greatest influence always have vigorous vocal critics before history looks more objectively at the entire story. Bibi has been with the conference many, many times, perhaps more than any other Israeli leader. He is with us tonight as leader of the opposition. Bibi, my several introductions of you to this conference as Prime Minister were to me cherished privileges. Please note that I feel exactly the same privilege tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, our close friend, Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Richard. That's very moving. And I'm not going to make a cynical comment about my mother and all that. But I know that you believe it deeply, and I appreciate that. And I'm very happy to be here. I mean that with old friends, Malcolm, William Darrow, Diane Loeb, Dan Mariashin, and everybody else who's masked like bank robbers. So I'm very happy to see all of you here. The only comment I'd make about what you said, it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. Israel could not become a world force unless we unleashed the economy. And the only way to unleash the economy was to introduce free market reforms. Jews prosper in free countries because they're able to bring their ingenuity, which is part of our culture, to bear to get competitive advantage. Israel had a lot of Jews, but no free markets. Technology without free markets doesn't get you very far. Free markets without technology get you technology very quickly. What we had to do, especially in the years 2003 to 2005, was to introduce a free market revolution in Israel. Once we did that, we could unleash the power of Israeli technology, thousands of startups, and anything, not just security. And that creates the movement. That creates the basis of power. And the basis of power is the joining of economic and technological power on the civilian side with military and intelligence power supported by cyber on the security side, and the two of them make you interesting to countries. So countries started coming to us instead of us going to them. In 1 year, I visited 6 continents. 1 year at their invitation. 1 year. Didn't go to Antarctica, but I think we would have done well with the penguins because they understand they can separate black and white, right from wrong. You know, they don't have that problem. That's the fundament of the change that you see today because you can approach so many countries, hundreds and hundreds of leaders who were here, and they all wanted to partake of the benefits that Israeli technology and ingenuity could give them. But it doesn't go anywhere if you tax it at 65% marginal tax rate. It just doesn't go anywhere. It goes to Silicon Valley. It doesn't stay here. But if you want them to come back, you have to lower tax rates, you have to deregulate, you have to help them with tax credits, you have to help them with R&D. You want to hear all this? No, this is not what we're talking about today. But you started. You started. So I just bring that to your attention. This wasn't an incidental revolution. It was a deliberate, systemic revolution with an idea that you're familiar with in the United States, but was strangely absent here. And that's the idea of free markets that would unleash the inherent ingenuity of our people and enterprise. That's another lecture. What I want to talk to you about today is the other component that brought us peace. Not the straitjacket Palestinian peace that they've been telling us for years. You know, you can't get peace with the Arab world until you get peace with the Palestinians. Well, that's a problem because the Palestinians don't want peace. They don't want a state next to Israel, as you know. They want a state instead of Israel. So they'd veto any peace that we would make with an Arab country they opposed every peace we made with Egypt or with Jordan. They opposed it. They opposed anything we do. So if we waited for the Palestinians to have a breakthrough with them in order to get to the Arab world, we'd never get there. And indeed, for a quarter of a century, we didn't get there. We didn't go anywhere. Because we waited to solve the Palestinian problem, because there's no way you remember all that. No way you can break out to the Arab world unless you break out to the Palestinians. I thought it would work the other way around, that we would go around the Palestinian veto, that the road to peace doesn't go through Ramallah, it goes around Ramallah. And that's essentially what we did. But to do that, we needed not only the allure of Israeli technology and products that I just described, not only that, that's a positive impetus. We needed a negative impetus, and the negative impetus was provided by Iran. This is the only good thing that came out of the JCPOA. How come nobody's laughing? It's the only good thing that came out of the JCPOA, okay? The Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries, understood they couldn't rely on a policy that essentially paved its path with gold to a nuclear arsenal. And so they sought a new partnership with us because we stood very strongly against this deal and against Iran and acted against Iran in a variety of ways. And that brought us together. That was a tremendous engine that brought Israel and the Arab states together, brought me with Arab leaders together in secret meetings well before 2016. It was the stance, more than anything else, the firm stance we took against Iran and the flawed nuclear deal that brought Israel and Arab states together and laid the foundation for the Abraham Accords. Now, I think we couldn't have sealed the Abraham Accords without the United States. And without President Trump's assistance. But the basic, and his team, but the basic foundation was laid before that in the events that led to and followed the signing of the JCPOA. My approach to, can I have a chair? Is that possible? I still have 10 minutes to go. You needn't worry, but, oh, much better, thank you. Is that all right? Can you still see me, hear me? Okay. All right, so now what is the problem with the Iran Accords, okay? We live in a world that is divided between East and West. These are dramatic times. But essentially, the conflict between East and West is a conflict between the United States and the rising power in Asia, which is China. I think everybody understands that. It's both competition, adversity. It's not broken out, and I hope will not break out into more intense sorts of conflict. The great powers, even if they come from ideologically different positions, tend to have a way of limiting conflict, finding a way to channel it, ultimately to get it under control. That's what they generally do in the last 100 years, 70 years, 80 years. I don't think, well, I'm not going to belabor this point, but I will say this, that interstitched right between East and West is a malignant ideology, a malignancy that obeys none of the rules of restraint that I just described. And that malignancy is militant Islam. Militant Islam has two fountainheads. One, Sunni radicalism, and the other is Shiite radicalism. The Sunni radicalism of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on, familiar with, they all want to be king of the Islamist hill. They have they have a goal of caliphates and so on, all these, and of the Islamic State, but they lack one thing. They lack a state. Radical Shiism has a state. That state is called Iran. It is just as pernicious, just as deadly, more deadly than the radical Sunnis, and it has a state. That state, encompassing about 100 million people, which they've commandeered and hijacked in 1979, gives them enormous power. You have to imagine what the world would be like if ISIS had satellites, submarines, warships, drones, and so on. That's what Iran has. Now you have to think, what will happen if ISIS had chemical weapons or nuclear weapons? Iran is busy developing both, okay? The prospect, the marriage of militant Islam and nuclear weapons is the greatest danger the world faces. It is the greatest danger we face because they openly say what all the militant Islamists are saying, Shiites and Sunnis alike, we're going to destroy you. But they also say, well, you're the small Satan. You know who the great Satan is. America is the great Satan. And I always offend my European friends when I tell them, you know, you're just a middle-sized Satan. But they're on target. They're on the target list. And they're developing ICBMs in Iran, not for us. They're developing it for Europe. They're developing it for the United States. You already have an experience with a rogue regime that sits on an anthill economy, about 5% of Israel's GDP. It's called North Korea. But it developed atomic weapons. It developed the means to deliver them, And, whether now or very soon, they'll reach Los Angeles and very soon New York too. You get orbital systems, you could reach anywhere on Earth. The danger of having that from North Korea is obvious. The NPT doesn't help you. How about agreements? Well, you had agreements. You had agreements with North Korea. That didn't help. Didn't stop it. No agreement could stop the development of nuclear weapons unless it's accompanied by two things. One thing is sanctions, crippling economic sanctions. That doesn't work by itself either. The other thing is a strong military threat, which may have to be exercised. Israel exercised it a couple of times. And the Iraq reactor and the Deir ez-Zor reactor sort of stops it. For all times? No, but, a few decades, not bad, right? Unless you have this combination of military, a strong military threat, which you're prepared to exercise, and crippling sanctions, which increase the cost, you cannot stop the arming of these rogue regimes by, by agreements. Gaddafi, by the way, saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, so he basically gave it up because he didn't want to be clobbered over the head, okay? But Iran did the following. You still listening to me? No, it's okay, okay, all right. Iran thought it was going to be clobbered. When I was at MIT in 1976, I came there, 72, sorry. I came there. The biggest foreign contingents of students were Iranian students in the nuclear engineering department. That's the Shah. A few years later, Shah is toppled. The Ayatollahs come in and they continue to develop the program. As they develop the program, of course, a military nuclear program, because Iran has plenty of oil, it doesn't really need, nuclear civilian plants. It begins the work of creating enrichment, nuclear Iranian enrichment. You know that there are 20 civilian nuclear powers in the world. They don't enrich. You don't need enriched uranium. You need enriched uranium for one thing only, nuclear bombs. You need underground bunkers in which you put centrifuges for enriched uranium for one thing only, nuclear bombs. You develop missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and medium-range missiles for one thing only, nuclear bombs. You do not deliver them, to carry a payload of 500 kilograms of TNT from Tehran to New York. It's ridiculous. Very expensive. It does make sense, okay? So Iran is out pursuing a military nuclear program. And when the United States decides to invade Iraq and to bring down Saddam Hussein, they were sure that the United States would give them an ultimatum to dismantle their nuclear program. Agreement, no agreement, dismantle your nuclear program. I said as much to my American colleagues before they went into Iraq the second time. I said, the whole point, if you knock out this guy, Saddam, okay, we already knocked out his nuclear program, but if you knock it out, fine. It doesn't work unless you use that to tell Iran, now you dismantle it or you're next. Your program. My advice wasn't taken there. There was a New Yorker article explaining the neocons who brought you Iraq and the Arab thing. They said there's this guy, Israeli guy, who's worse because he said go after Iran. That's right. That's what I said. I said Iraq makes sense if you go with Iran. Okay? It adds sense to it. Okay? They didn't. But the Iranians thought, that's what they thought. The Iranians thought that the Americans would follow through. And to anticipating that, what they did was they took their nuclear military program and they hid it in a civilian program with an organization called SAPAND. Okay, this is civilian scientific research baloney. This was the nuclear program in all its aspects, hidden in these various so-called research institutions. How do we know that? Because a few years ago I sent the Mossad to to Tehran to take away their secret nuclear archive, bring it here. 50 years from now, we'll tell that story. I call it Argo and steroids, super steroids, it's beyond belief. But here, we got 150,000 documents, CDs, and so on. And you can see, this is what they did. They're planning to build nuclear bombs, they're hiding it, and so on. Now, Iran all the time is dealing, negotiating on this or that level with the West to try to deceive it, to say that they're not doing this, okay? I thought that the thing that had to be done was to apply very strong sanctions, and I couldn't get anywhere with this idea. I was leader of the opposition. I came back to this, wow, 20 years later or whatever, okay? This is before, this is in 2004 or 5. And I was the opposition leader. I went to see Omer. He was prime minister, and I said, look, we've got to start placing sanctions on Iran. Okay, he knows this is strange fixation that I have on Iran for some reason, okay? And I said, look, I have a suggestion to you, but I'll only do it with your blessing. I'll start going to the individual state funds, investment funds of the 50 states, and we'll start getting them to disinvest from Iran. And he said, okay, well, it keeps them busy and happy, why not? Let them do it. So I went and did about 20 of these, the biggest ones, California and New York and so on. And we got them to disinvest. Then I met a candidate for the American presidency called Barack Obama. I met him in a superintendent's office in Reagan National Airport. He was coming to Washington. I was leaving, I think, an APAC meeting. And he said, you know, I appreciate this. I'm going to put a bill, a federal bill, to authorize and accelerate the various state divestment plans. I said, wonderful. He did it. I was very happy. When he got elected, I soon learned that he was negotiating secretly with the Iranians. This was making a deal with Iran was a great goal in his mind. The fact that this deal cannot go anywhere if it's not coupled with crippling sanctions and a credible military threat is something that I said over and over again, including to, by now, President Obama. Now, there's one thing about military power and deterrence. Napoleon said it. You know what force is, and therefore also deterrence? It's mass times will. If you have enormous mass but zero will, you have zero. Okay? So you needed to have this threat. And Iran initially thought they had this threat. If not from America, then from Israel, led by me. I would attack them. They came to the table. Once they came to the table, the deal that should have been made was not made. That deal should have insisted, and still should insist, on three things. First, dismantle all enrichment. There is no reason for you to have enrichment other than nuclear bombs, okay? So dismantle all those centrifuges, stop the R&D that makes the centrifuges 30 times more effective. Dismantle your infrastructure, your military nuclear infrastructure, number one. Number two, stop the ballistic missiles program, which are meant to deliver these nuclear weapons, okay? Number three, stop the research on the weapon, okay? None of that is in the deal. A fourth thing would be stop the terror, stop the aggression. That's not in the deal either. In fact, what the deal does is none of this. It just says you can go ahead and enrich in unlimited capacities a few years from now. That's all the deal says. You don't enrich at this rate now, but you can develop, you can have R&D to develop centrifuges 30, 40 times more effective than you have now, so you can enrich and use them 10 years' time. By now, it's about 2.5 years from now. That's what the deal does. It's a highway paved in gold, because in the meantime, you're getting hundreds of billions of dollars because sanctions are released. So you're not even kicking the can down the road. It's a nuclear can, okay? Very quickly. That's all you're doing. You're just postponing it by a few years, but giving a kosher seal of international approval for Iran's development into a threshold nuclear state where it could go to nuclear weapons like that. Because the most difficult thing in making nuclear weapons is enrichment. That's the toughest thing. It's tougher than the weapon, it's tougher than the missiles. That's what the deal does. So naturally, I opposed it. Naturally, unnaturally, I went to the U.S. Congress to oppose it because you don't do that just as a matter of, you just don't say, well, it's nothing, Of course, it's a very big thing. And I did it not as a Republican or as a Democrat. I did it as an Israeli patriot, just as I opposed George W. Bush and George Bush Sr. when I thought they were pursuing policies that were inimical to Israel. I was kicked out of the State Department by Secretary of State Jim Baker, And I went and talked to 50 senators during the Chomat Magen, how do you say that? The anti-terror operation that Sharon led, and President George W. Bush said, you got to stop now. I called Arik. I said, listen, I could go to Washington, and I think I can help you reverse that. And I did. And I went there and spoke to 50 senators, Republicans, Democrats alike, and I said, this is wrong. This is wrong. Terrorists were exploding in our cities. We have a right, we have a duty to fight it, and I did. I went there as an Israeli patriot, and I think also as a citizen of the world, and said this deal endangers not only the survival of my country, but the peace of the world. It is a tragic historic mistake. Well, it passed. It wasn't a treaty, so you needed 2/3 to bring it down. I don't have 2/3 here. I certainly could get it there. Well, I don't know about that. But I didn't. He's telling me to stop. When you fall asleep, I'll stop. So if you want me to stop, fall asleep, okay? We couldn't stop the deal. He made the deal. But I thought that it was important for me, even though I was criticized here by some of the people you'll talk to. It's not important, okay? I thought it was important to keep the torch up, alive, up in the air, because somebody else could go out of this deal and go back to crippling sanctions and a credible military threat. On the eve of the 2016 elections, I went to see two presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and I told them what I just told you. I said, you've got to get out of this deal. You've got to put the squeeze on Iran, and they have to know that you mean it. A credible military threat doesn't mean an all-out war. It doesn't mean war at all. It means a pinpointed strike on their nuclear targets. Nobody goes to war with the United States. Nobody. They're very careful about it. And there are many ways to skin that cat, and I don't want to talk about it here, okay? But that has to be stopped. You can find 100 ways. We're tired, we have fatigue, we have this, we have that. You want a world in which a militant Islamist state, Ayatollahs have nuclear weapons and the means to reach New York and Los Angeles? If you want that, be tired. Churchill said, you remember, he said in Munich, what did he say? He said they had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor and they got war. This will bring war. This deal that they're now coming back to will mean that the Middle East will become nuclear, that at least 3 other countries will go nuclear. So you'll have a nuclear tinderbox here. This will bring war, a terrible war. And when Iran has a nuclear umbrella, what do you think it will do with its aggression? Much higher level. This will bring a whole set of other wars. Well, Trump got elected. He got out of the deal. I was very happy with that. He started applying sanctions, to which people immediately say, what? What do you mean? What do you mean? Look, they enriched more than they did before. Do you know how much they would have enriched without all the pressures that we put on them over the years? In 2006, we had a visit by Mohammad Bardeh, who was the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, here in the Knesset, in the Defense and Security Committee. And he said, Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee. And he said, there is nothing you can do. Accept it. By 2012, Iran will have nuclear weapons, an arsenal of nuclear weapons. We're 10 years beyond that. They were not have it because we applied those pressures on them, and they had to pay costs. And they were afraid also of a potential military response. Unless you rekindle that, you're going to a bad deal, except they're not going now to a bad deal, they're going to a worse deal, if one can even be anticipated. It has none of the elements that I described. It has a change of calendar instead of a change of behavior for Iran. It doesn't have to stop its aggression or terror. It doesn't deal with the missiles, doesn't deal with enrichment, doesn't deal with the bomb making, doesn't do anything. It actually even doesn't kick the can forward. It, what does it do? Just lightly nudges the can 2.5, 3 years. That's it. That's all this deal does. It is a horrible deal. And we should oppose it with every fiber of our being and every forum that we can address. And you should address. That's the end of this short, long lecture. I'm open to 1 or 2 questions, and I deliberately left no time for them, so go ahead. Yeah, please. There is. There is. Not only ours, by the way, but there is. There is.
I want to ask a question. Bibi, we've listened to a number of your colleagues, some on your side, some not on your side, but it has been more prevalent than I would have imagined for people to criticize strategically your decision to make that speech in Washington in 2015. I've always heard today your opinion that it was the correct thing to do, and I've always agreed with that. My question is, was there so much disagreement within the Knesset at that time? Were there so many people who thought you had done the wrong thing?
Well, much more. Many more. A lot of people in retrospect see how important that was. But at the time, I was subject to enormous amount of attacks. For example, what were they arguing? They were arguing, first of all, you're not going to stop it, so agree to it. And I said, well, nobody can be more Catholic than the Pope, and nobody can be more pro-Israel than Israel. If Israel accepts the deal, then it's a done deal. You can never refuse the nuclearization of Iran because the #1 target accepts it. Second thing they said was, no, go for the money. If you go against the President of the United States, which is not a simple thing to do, you jeopardize the 10-year memorandum of understanding that was important for our defense people. We got up to that point about $30 billion in a defense agreement. And I said, no, I don't think so. They said, you're not going to get it. I said, no, it's precisely the opposite. We will get it because I think there will be an interest to reaffirm the basic commitment of a U.S. administration to Israel precisely when we are critical of the way they're dealing with Iran. They'll compensate it in the other place. Now, that criticism can be judged over time. After the deal came, we made an MOU not for $30 billion, but for $38 billion with Obama. So that assessment was wrong. The other assessment that they had was this will jeopardize any peacemaking possibilities that we have. That assessment was wrong. We had 4 historic peace treaties, okay? The other assessment they said was you're going to have a rupture with the Democratic Party, which is very common. Everybody says it because the political class always says these things here and there. Gallup made a poll. It does an annual tracking poll of the attitudes towards Israel. They do it every February. The speech was in March. In February of 2015, Gallup polled Democrats and everyone else. 48% of the Democratic voters were sympathetic to Israel. A year later, the speech in between, that number rose to 53%, net gain of 5%. By the way, I can tell you that when I took office, Israel's standing in the United States was 63%. That was when I took office in 2009. When I left office, it shot up to 75%. The American people, Democrats and Republicans, basically get it. The Republican support is more intense, but there is a widespread understanding. Iran is bad, Israel is good. It ain't that complicated, but it's complicated for some of the people here to see. Now, the argument that we would just benefit by kicking the can a bit has all the wrong logic behind it. Because, you know, the thing about time is it passes. Now you're stuck. You're going to be stuck with an Iran that has an Israeli approval, an Israeli acquiescence, and a great power approval, international approval, that you can enrich without limitation. And this, by these great strategic minds here, that makes sense for Israel. Because we're not going to get peace, because we're not going to get American money, because we're not going to get... You judge who was right, who was wrong.
A slightly different question. Is it possible that your position and Israel's position had a positive impact on the Abraham Accords and the countries that did the...
It's not possible. That's what Arab leaders...
Main reason?
Arab leaders, Richard, Arab leaders, I'm not going to, maybe I'll write about it in my book, but I have to think about that.
You're among friends.
Well, yeah, well, we'll see. But Arab leaders flocked to Israel and flocked to talk to me because of, if there's one thing that happened, I would say, that multiplied Israel's standing in the Arab world, it was a speech in Congress. Not only in the Arab world, in the world. Multiplied it many, many times over. And certainly didn't reduce it in America country. See, the political class always talks that way. I mean, the Ben Rhodes of the world and all that, they're all politicized. And people repeated, yeah, we have a problem. Yeah, we have a problem with people who have these policies. We have a problem if we don't stand up to them. But in the general sway of things, I would say that speech, first of all, kept the torch and enabled another president to go out of that deal. And it still will enable another president to go out of that deal. Or this president. And I hope he does. Yeah.
Are there other actors in the international community beyond the region whose voices are allied with Israel on the subject of the Iran deal?
Some of the Europeans talk like that, but they don't really act like that. Talk is cheap. No, beyond the Arab countries. He says. Beyond the Arab countries. The Arab countries, they all agree. You know, if the U.S. is okay with it, well, who are we to be? You know, and if Russia is okay with it, or China is okay with it, what are we going to come in? The answer is, I don't know about that. But sometimes, and I've said over and over again, and that was my policy, and God willing, if I'm back in office, that will be my policy, okay? That with or without an agreement, Israel will do what it needs to do to defend itself. It doesn't bind us. It doesn't limit us. We don't accept it. I don't. And I speak out against it with a clear voice, which you can judge if you hear from others here. What's the presentation? This is case 9000. I object. You should see the previous. You should see the previous cases.
When you see it, you might admire it, but I don't think it'll worry you in the slightest.
Thank you.
It is a beautiful piece of art, and it says words from Yeshayahu Navi, Isaiah the prophet, "Laman Sion lo echshel, laman Yerushalayim lo eshkot." For the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem, I will not rest. And great. How could that be more relevant to this conversation tonight?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.